Welcome to a new episode of Leipzig Studies in Religion. In this series, we present publications by researchers from the Institute for the Study of Religion at Leipzig University. Our deep dive today focuses on an article by Christoph Klein titled Formations of Secularity in Ancient Japan, on cultural encounters, critical junctures, and path-dependent processes.
It was published back in 2019 in the Journal of Religion in Japan as part of a special issue on secularities.
And the puzzle we're tackling is, well, it's absolutely fascinating, and it's still highly relevant to modern politics.
It really is.
If you look at post-war Japan, especially with the constitution put in place after the war, it appears to be a strictly laicist state.
Right. The idea was a clear separation of religion and government, a total break from the past, specifically designed to dismantle state Shinto.
That's the theory. A clean break.
But the reality on the ground is that the boundary between what we call the religious and the secular is, well, it's incredibly messy. It's constantly being contested, even today.
And you see that tension playing out all the time in the political arena. I mean, we're not talking about abstract academic debates here.
No, not at all. We're talking about direct attempts to legislate this ambiguity. You just have to look at the ruling Liberal Democratic Party, the LDP.
They're constantly trying to amend key constitutional articles, right? Articles 20 and 89.
Exactly. And it's all about finding these loopholes. They want to allow public funding or public activities that look very, very religious, as long as they can claim the religious content does not exceed the sphere of social festivities and folkloric activities.
And that is the crucial, legally loaded phrase, Shakai teki kiremata wa shuguteki kuchi no hani okonai.
Which is a mouthful.
It is, but it's their legal escape hatch. They're saying, look, if it looks like culture, it's not religion, and therefore we can support it with public funds.
But who gets to draw that line? The line is deliberately blurry, and that blurriness is exactly what they're trying to exploit.
But here's the core argument of this deep dive, which is so compelling. This current dilemma, it isn't new. It's not just a post-war problem.
Not at all. The article argues that this problem of classifying Shinto rituals as either culture or religion is really just a symptom.
Not the cause.
Exactly. We are going to unpack the hypothesis that Japan's specific and, yes, very ambiguous appropriation of Western secularity in the 19th century is fundamentally path-dependent.
Path-dependent on what?
On highly durable structural choices made over 1,000 years earlier, specifically between the 6th and 8th centuries. It's a deep historical current, not just a surface ripple.
But that's a huge claim. Doesn't that sort of diminish the agency of the Meiji reformers? I mean, are we saying they were just following a 1,400-year-old script when they decided what was religion, shuk, and what wasn't?
Not following a script, no, but definitely working within a pre-built stage set. Let's start with that Meiji period, after 1868. Why did they even need to define these terms in the first place?
They were playing catch-up, geopolitically.
That's it. The main driver was external pressure. They desperately needed to be accepted as a modern, civilized nation-state by the Western powers.
And that acceptance was non-negotiable if they wanted to avoid colonization.
Absolutely. And to the West, being civilized meant adopting things like a constitution and, crucially, religious freedom, which, of course, first required you to define what religion actually was.
So they had this impossible task. They needed to claim religious freedom to appease the West, but at the same time, create a powerful state ideology centered on the emperor. That's a huge contradiction.
A contradiction they had to solve with bureaucracy. And their solution was, frankly, ingenious. They classified imperial Shinto Kitsu Shinto and shrine Shinto Jinju Shinto as non-religious.
Maishuki.
This let them promote a tenny-centric national cult, framing it as patriotic duty, as tradition, while telling the West they guaranteed freedom for Buddhists and Christians.
But why did that move stick? I mean, it must have been seen as a transparent political trick at the time. How are they able to make that distinction credible?
Well, because for other traditions, the categorization was actually pretty easy. Take Buddhism, for example.
Yeah.
It was already recognizable as a separate institutionalized religion. The source calls it an axial religion. It had, voluntary affiliation, a defined clergy, its own buildings, a clear separation from the administration of a specific territory.
So it fit the box. What about the new religious communities?
Same thing. Sect Shinto, or Kisha Shinto, they were also these discrete units that fit the imported Western definition of Shikyo almost perfectly.
So the Meiji elites didn't really have to invent a category for Buddhism.
No, the category was already waiting for them, built into the social and legal landscape for centuries.
That's the key insight then. These antecedent structures, the path dependencies, had already made it easy to separate something like Buddhism from state affairs.
Exactly. The Meiji government was just leveraging a separation that had been institutionalized for over a millennium.
Which brings us to the analytical tools for this. The article's framework uses critical junctures and path dependencies.
Right. And a critical juncture is basically a moment of heightened importance in history. A relatively short period of time, often a crisis, where the choices that are made have a much, much higher chance of shaping the long-term outcome.
It's like a fork in the road.
Mm-hmm.
And the choice you make today determines the kind of road you're on centuries later.
A perfect analogy. And the consequence of choosing that fork is path dependency. Once you're on a path, it creates momentum. It gets harder and harder to turn back because you've built up all these rules and institutions, those durable structures that limit your future options.
So for modern Japan, the immediate critical juncture was, what, Commodore Perry in 1852?
Unquestionably. That enforced opening created the crisis, but the reactions and the decisions of the Meiji reformers, specifically how they classified Shinto,
They were conditioned.
they were completely conditioned by the path dependencies established much, much earlier. They were forced onto a pre-existing path.
Okay, let's follow that path all the way back. Let's go to the 6th century. What was the initial shock, the ancient critical juncture that set all this in motion?
Again, it was intensely geopolitical. The Yamato state looked across the sea and saw this immense power of unified China under the Sui and Tang dynasties.
And things were heating up on the Korean peninsula.
Very much so. It all culminated in the extinction of their main ally, the Kingdom of Baekje, in 660 CE.
That must have been terrifying. The fear of invasion would have been very real.
Oh, absolutely. They realized their old, decentralized clan system couldn't protect them. So, just like the Meiji reformers would do centuries later, they embarked on this crash course in modernization, learning from their powerful neighbors.
And that meant massive structural changes. The official introduction of Buddhism.
Which was a vehicle for all sorts of sophisticated continental culture.
And critically, the Taika reform, starting in 646.
Yes. The Taika reform completely transformed the old clan order into a centralized monarchical statutory state, a Ritsuri state. It was a total overhaul, modeled heavily on the Tang system.
And this centralization led directly to that key organizational split, the one that created the early, durable distinctions between ritual and religion for the state.
That's right. They created a dual system right at the top of government. You had the Daiji-kan, the Grand Council of State.
Think of it as the central cabinet, handling all the mundane political stuff.
Exactly. And then right beside it, they established the Jinnikan, the Office of God's Affairs.
So 2 separate formal ministries, one for running the country and one just for managing the ancient native rights.
And that institutional differentiation was revolutionary. It symbolically separated the 2 traditional functions of the emperor, governance, or sei, and ritual, or sei.
Even though the Jinjukan was subordinate to the Daijikan.
It was, but just creating that separate administrative box paved the way for conceptually disentangling ritual from governance.
Which is so important, because down the line, that's what allows the emperor's actual political power, his kenryoku, to transform into symbolic ritual authority kenni.
Now let's look at how they handled Buddhism. The state created a legal distinction that really favored Buddhist autonomy, even while it was under state control.
How did they do that?
They implemented 2 parallel sets of laws. You had the Jinjuri for the native gods' affairs, run by the Jinkakan, but for the Buddhist community, they created something totally different. The Sunyuri.
Regulations for monks and nuns.
Specific regulations for monks and nuns. And this was critical because the Sunyuri defined them as a distinct, state-controlled, but still separate social group.
So they weren't just another type of government official.
Not at all. They were set apart from the general population and from the bureaucracy. And this legal framework was incredibly important because it helped Buddhist organizations establish themselves as separate social formations known as jaik.
So even under state supervision, they were legally autonomous social units.
Right. So centuries before the Meiji reformers needed a word for religion, the Yamato state had already institutionally defined Buddhism as a discrete entity, separate from the core administration.
That is a deep, deep path dependency.
And it was only reinforced by crisis. We have to talk about the Dikshus affair in the late Nara period.
This is where a Buddhist priest, Dikshus, got a little too close to power.
A little too close is putting it mildly. He nearly managed to usurp the imperial authority entirely. A major crisis.
Which must have caused an institutional panic.
It did. And the backlash resulted in a much stricter separation between the imperial household, its main ritual center at Ai Shrine, and Buddhism.
They walled it off.
They essentially ensured Ais remained a purely non-Buddhist site of imperial ritual. This made it structurally impossible to establish a Caesaropapism, where the emperor is also the supreme head of the religion.
And this leads us to that really durable medieval concept of dual rule.
Yes. By the time Kanmu Tenno moves the capital to Kyushu in 794, the big Buddhist institutions, like Tendai and Shingon, are becoming even more independent. This reality was then legitimized by the ideology of dual rule. The Juppu and the Buppu.
The ruler's law and the Buddha Dharma.
Exactly. Two interdependent nomospheres or spheres of law. The Io was responsible for the mundane world, the Sekin state craft, justice, taxes.
And the Bupa.
The Bupa was for the supramundane, the Shosekin spiritual matters, salvation, cosmic harmony. They needed each other, but they occupied different institutional spaces. This became a very stable plausibility structure for the state-religion relationship for centuries.
Which made classifying Buddhism in the 19th century almost predictable.
Almost a foregone conclusion.
Let's pivot now to what might be the most important decision made back then. The one that secured the imperial line and, by extension, created the structural ambiguity of Shinto later on. What option did the Japanese explicitly reject?
They rejected the foundational Chinese concept of imperial legitimacy.
Yeah.
The mandate of heaven, or Tiananmen.
Right, the idea that heaven grants the right to rule to a just ruler, but can take it away if the ruler becomes unworthy. It's what justified dynastic change in China.
And rejecting that was essential for the Yamato state. First, it would have invited all sorts of diplomatic entanglements with China, which only recognized one son of heaven, the Tianzi.
And internally.
Internally, it would have made the imperial line inherently unstable, always vulnerable to challenges.
So instead of adopting that meritocratic but risky system, Tenmu Tenno doubled down on a local alternative.
He did. He secured his dynasty by commissioning a unified state mythology, the one documented in the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki.
And this mythology stressed the hereditary charisma of divine rulers.
Exactly. Rulers entitled to rule eternally. It essentially made the Yamato line untouchable, indispensable for the existence of the nation.
Wow. So it kept the imperial house independent of both of the big imported systems, Confucianism and Buddhism, for its primary mythological legitimation.
And that independence had incredible staying power. Because the emperor's primary legitimacy rested on this immutable myth, he could afford to become a mere symbolic figurehead for the mundane sphere, the Shibu, during the medieval periods.
While the military aristocracy, the Buke, held all the actual political power.
Right. The emperor was essential for ritual, but not for day-to-day governance.
And that unique mythological foundation, that's what later reformers, driven by nativism, would cling to.
It's the ideological basis for modern tenet-centric nationalism and state Shinto. It was this reservoir of legitimacy that couldn't be categorized by the old Ubyu Buposhi framework. It wasn't political Chubyu, and it wasn't spiritual Buppo, it was something else.
Foundational myth.
Foundational myth.
Okay, let's synthesize all of this. Let's bring it full circle back to the modern legal debates we started with. How did these ancient decisions shape modern secularity?
Well, you see two major interconnected path dependencies. First, the classification of Buddhism was made simple. The ancient institutional autonomy, the Jaik, the separate legal system with the Sunshiri, and that long-standing Ubutushi idea. It meant Buddhism arrived in the 19th century already conceptually defined as a discrete religion. The Meiji government just had to slap the Western label Shukyu onto a structure that was already there.
And the second path dependency. That's the one that explains the ambiguity of Shinto, the core political problem today.
Yes, that ambiguity is a direct result of the Meiji reformers creating this hybrid construct. They needed the emperor, his rituals, the kami worship to be foundational to the state, but they also had to claim they weren't violating religious freedom.
And because the imperial cult's components, its myths, its rituals, were never fully allocated to a single religious system in the past, thanks to that ancient separation of the Jingakan and Daichikan and rejecting the mandate of heaven.
It left this massive gray area, a reservoir of cultural elements that could be reconfigured in the 19th century as a non-religious state cult.
Which the LDP today is trying to define as acceptable folkloric activities.
Precisely. The structure wasn't created to define modern secularity. It was created to stabilize a precarious state 1400 years ago. But those stabilizing mechanisms became the constraints that defined the limits of political possibility centuries later.
So the most significant finding, as shown in Christoph Klein's work, is that Japan's modern secularity isn't really a fresh constitutional debate. It's a reflection of these specific, durable social and epistemic structures forged during that ancient critical juncture.
Key decisions had long-term unintended consequences.
Decisions like rejecting the mandated heaven, separating the Jingikan from the Dujken, and defining Buddhism through the Sunri, they all created these path dependencies. They made it easy to classify Buddhism, but left the imperial-centric cult perpetually ambiguous.
An ambiguity that continues to fuel all these legal and political debates over the line between culture and religion today. It's a powerful lesson in state building.
So the fundamental question this deep dive leaves us with is this. If the distinction between culture, custom, and religion in Japan stems from political decisions made over 1400 years ago, primarily to stabilize a precarious ruling dynasty, does that distinction truly reflect modern social reality and individual faith? Or does it only reflect a historical political expediency that powerful actors continue to exploit today? It's really a question of deep history versus modern law. Thank you for listening, and we hope to welcome you back for another episode of our series, Leipzig Studies in Religion.